Today, we will be talking about the aspect of females in the Bible, but talking more about sort of some implications of prophecy. And this will be kind of interesting for some cool reasons. Because, like before we kind of talked about different positions, how like females can be, you can find females can be positions all throughout like leadership in church. Then we kind of talked about this legendary issue, can females teach? And of course, I went through that whole thing because, that's a whole issue that a lot of people have. And then we went through talking about like sort of gender norms and different things like that, which kind of is a whole interesting topic in and of itself. And it's interesting how like when you look at the Bible view of things, it's not what we have in our modern day context. And even in the last 2,000 years or so, it hasn't actually even been accurate how people represented how like the biblical portrayal versus a lot of different cultures and things like that. It's like, it's not actually even the same. Like the Bible has a very different perspective on things than, most humans have made mistakes of it for hundreds of years. But today we're going to shift talking about the controversial stuff. So hopefully this won't be too controversial going forward from here on. And we'll start talking about some prophetic applications now. So, if I can turn this on. All right, so now you get to Genesis 3, right? You have Genesis 3, Genesis 3, 14 to 15. Does anyone want to read?
The Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all beasts of the field. And on your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel."
It's interesting how when you look at the very first prophecy in the Bible, it has to do with the woman and her seed and different things like the seed of serpent and all this and that. It becomes kind of interesting. That's the first time any sort of prophecy happens in the entire Bible. It has to do with the woman, right? Now, we have this weird thing with this war between these two seeds. Now, the first one is the seed of the woman. And one thing we'll kind of talk about going forward kind of today is how when you look at this ends up becoming a specific reference that there's going to be a promised Messiah that was going to come through and finally destroy the serpent and stuff like that. You have this weird sort of idea of the seed of the serpent. And one interesting thing is, is it Satan's Messiah? Is this, what's going on here? Because, we talk about the Antichrist and things like that, which could be an interesting sort of play how like whenever God has something, you often find how Satan tries to have a counterfeit for that. And it's interesting how, like, when you ever look at the Bible, you see the Antichrist as, kind of Satan's version of Christ in some way, kind of copying whatever God does. Of course, there's an interesting thing we could be talking about Genesis 6 or different things like that. Another interesting thing is kind of talking about how Satan is always trying to destroy the nation of God, using other nations, which is kind of interesting. How, like, when you look at the seed in terms of, like, a people group, in that sort of sense, it's interesting how, like, as a people group, Satan's always trying to use other people to do that. Of course, it's kind of interesting because all of history can be boiled down to a small little thing. It's Satan's attempt to stop God's plan of redemption. Also, Satan's attempt to try to stop God's promises, which becomes kind of interesting. Because let me go back to the first part of this because I put my slides out of order. All right, so you come here. So first thing, you find that Satan is always trying to corrupt man and God's always trying to correct people. The second thing you find always happening is that Satan is trying to destroy God's people and God's always preserving something called a remnant. And what you'll find is all throughout like the Old Testament and all that, you'll find that basically constantly there's a whole group of people that are wiped out or something like that. But God always keeps one sort of group or one person intact for a specific purpose. And that happens literally all throughout the Old Testament. And you can even, you can probably argue too in the in Book of Revelation, different things like that happens as well. But, it's interesting how that's a very constant thing you can find. So now we get to the layout of basically all of history. First things first is you find that man's corruption in Genesis 6. And then all of a sudden, God preserves Noah. Everything else is destroyed, but Noah and his family is preserved. Then all of a sudden, Satan tries to form his first global government in a sense, where you have the Tower of Babel, where everyone's together. And what does God do? Well, God tries to scatter the people, so that way, God tries to scatter the people, so that way, what's the word? Whatever problems are going on there, it's not going to persist. Then all of a sudden, the nations are all worshiping other gods, and God calls Abraham to be separate to start a separate and chosen people. Then you keep going, and God has a promised land. And Satan basically takes control of the promised land. And here you find that, Abraham is promised this land, but the Canaanites and all these Hittites and all these people are already in that land and stuff. Then you say, okay, God tries to bring his people to the land. And Satan tries to scare the people and different things like that. A little bit out of order, my apology, but it's technically that should be a little after. But anyway, there's a famine going on, right? And God uses Joseph to protect and to provide for his people. All right, so next thing is Satan tries to enslave God's people. And of course, God delivers them through Moses. And interesting enough is God's getting ready to use Moses. And of course, Pharaoh tries to kill all the babies, right? It's interesting how the whole way through, all you find is the people, Satan trying to destroy God's people, God trying to preserve somebody, or it's Satan trying to corrupt people, and God trying to rally them back together. Then you find, God brings them to the promised land, and then Satan tries to scare them again. All of a sudden, God gives them the land, going through the whole book of Joshua. Then Satan tries to attack them from enemies outside of the land. And you go through the whole book of Judges. Then you have a king that's prepared, and yet the people want a different king. And then all of a sudden, God puts his king in place. And then, there's a civil war that breaks out. God tries to unite the people, and then several different kings, and there's a whole bunch of division. There's a bunch of different things that go on. And, and then Satan tries to corrupt God's people. And then God's constantly using the prophets to correct people and bring them back. And skipping a whole bunch of things, because you can go on and on, going through the whole entire Old Testament. But then you come over here where God finally is ready to bring in his Messiah, right? We have Jesus. He's finally born, all this sort of stuff. Well, Satan tries to kill all the babies again. Jesus is ready to go on a cross. And one thing I'll try to make an argument for, which if he had another Bible, so we can get into this, but it's almost as if once you get to that final week, Satan is doing everything in his power to keep Jesus from finally going to what God actually planned throughout the entire time. There's a whole court case that's completely illegal. None of the witnesses can agree, and they push forward anyway with the whole thing. All of a sudden now, there's a chance to get this guy Barabbas instead of Jesus on death row. And nope, they decide to go with the murderer over the guy that healed them for a few years. You can go on and on again, and Satan's constantly trying to stop everything that God's doing. Of course, doesn't stop there, because all Christians, we tend to stop at the cross and we're saved and that's about it. But guess what? You have your entire life ahead of you, right? Same thing with Jesus. It turns out Jesus has his life ahead of him too, in case you didn't know. God promises a kingdom. And of course, one thing you find once you go to the book of Revelation, you find that Satan tries to set up his own kingdom. And it's interesting how you can kind of find this sort of pattern going over and over again. Now, I'm going to make an argument here, if you guys are ready for this. I'm going to say, it turns out that female intervention in the Bible is the most important thing, and without it, it would have been impossible for Jesus to be the Messiah. And this is what we're going to talk about tonight, this sort of prophetic view of this. It might sound kind of crazy, what? But it turns out there's some very specific things that happen. So we'll go to the first example of this, and this is kind of the most straightforward example that you can find. Okay, we're going to talk about the most important exception in the New Testament, or in the Old Testament. Well, essentially Old and New. You need to kind of use both to put this together. But why do we have a virgin birth?
The seed has to come from God, not from man.
Okay, seed has to come from God and not from man. That's one thing. It's prophesied. But why was it prophesied? Why is that important? Ooh, that's a good question. Let's talk about this now. All right. And it turns out you go to Isaiah 7, 13 to 14. Here we have that prophecy.
And he said, "Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men, that you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel."
You say, okay, that's a very famous passage that we usually go through. But then something interesting happens. You go to Jeremiah 22, verse 30.
Thus says the Lord, "Write this man down as childless, a man who shall not succeed in his days, for none of his offspring shall succeed in sitting on the throne of David and ruling again in Judah."
Now, this seems like we have a little bit of a problem here, because here it seems like the king isn't following God, right? And then all of a sudden, what happens is he stops the royal line of David at this point at this king. And we have this problem because we know that the Messiah is supposed to come from we have this problem where the Messiah is supposed to come from the line of David. But yet here, God basically curses the line of David here, so what are you supposed to do with that? Now, no one can sit on the throne because all of a sudden from this point on, the king's line is cursed. And then, of course, when you go throughout the Old Testament, you find a whole bunch of promises where he promised to David and stuff that there's supposed to be an everlasting kingdom that lasts forever and all this and that. Well, like, God, what are you supposed to do here? If the kingdom is supposed to last forever and this kid doesn't have any more children, how in the world is there supposed to be a kingdom? All right? You say, okay. Turns out there's an exception to the rules when you get to Numbers 36, 6 to 9. And this, you can technically find this earlier in Numbers 27, 1 to 11. But we're going to go here because this is kind of when he kind of re-talks about the law. And then again, I think later in Joshua, when they actually take over the land, you'll find this issue come back up.
This is what the Lord commands concerning the daughters of Zelophehad. Let them marry whom they think best. Only they shall marry within the clan of the tribe of their father. The inheritance of the people of Israel shall not be transferred from one tribe to another. For every one of the people of Israel shall hold on to the inheritance of the tribes of his father. And every daughter who possesses an inheritance in any tribe of the people of Israel shall be wife to the one of the clan of the tribe of her fathers, so that every one of the people of Israel may possess the inheritance of his fathers. So no inheritance shall be transferred from one tribe to another, for each of the tribes of the people of Israel shall hold on to its own inheritance.
So basically, one thing that kind of happens before when you go to Numbers 27 when it first happens is this man has a couple daughters and no sons, and here like Moses is setting up all the laws about like when we get into and it's interesting. This is before they get the land. God already puts this in place before they even have the battle of Jericho, before they cross over the river, before all of that, right? God already puts this in place, and then here suddenly this father has these daughters and like, well, I have no children. Who's my inheritance going to? And then God gives Moses this exception that if if a man has no sons and he has some daughters, well then all of a sudden if they marry within the same tribe, that inheritance can pass through the daughters and can stay in the tribe, and you can pass inheritance on that way. Now the reason why that becomes interesting is because you get the genealogy of Matthew and Luke. And you sit there, and a lot of it's funny how like some people who really don't know what they're talking about try to pull up these things. If you look at the genealogies, they're different, and you'll actually see how they actually take a different turn one way or the other, after David or so. And people say, well, see, it's a contradiction because why are there two different genealogies? And there's a whole bunch of subtleties to it. But it's very interesting once you sit down and you actually diagram this out and you look at it a little more closely. Both of them follow up basically the same thing up to David. Luke basically goes all the way up to Adam and then comes forward and different things like that, but you get the basic same genealogy. What's interesting is that Matthew is kind of talking about the Messiah through sort of a Jewish line. So he's kind of thinking more of a Jew, kind of thinking about like the law, the Moses and stuff like that, and he's kind of going through the male line looking that way, and he ends with Joseph. Which makes sense. You go through the line of Judah and stuff like that, and that's the way he's presenting Jesus as the Messiah, because the Messiah is supposed to come from the line of David. Luke, on the other hand, tends to look at Jesus' humanity, and he looks at the bloodline of David, but what he does is when you actually go through the genealogy, you'll find that he actually takes a turn and doesn't just go through, I think it's Solomon. He doesn't go through Solomon. He goes through another child that David had, and he goes through that bloodline, and that one ends up at Mary. And you sit there, and that becomes kind of interesting. Because essentially, Joseph marries Mary and then adopts Jesus as his child. The reason why that's kind of interesting is that they're both in the line of David, technically. And Jesus has the right to inherit the land because, through Joseph, that's the legal inheritance for the throne. Mary has the legal bloodline of David. So that way you still have both intact, that he can still inherit the throne. And this actually coincides with the law that, they're from the same tribe. They're not supposed to Jesus couldn't, Mary couldn't have been a Levite, and then Joseph couldn't have been from the tribe of Judah, and then have them marry, and the inheritance wouldn't cross over. See, since they're from the exact same tribe and all this works out, Jesus can now inherit the throne of David. Without the females actually coming forward and bringing this to Moses to petition, to get this sorted out, Jesus could not have been the Messiah. Now let's talk about Rahab a bit. So hopefully you guys remember the story. Here we have Joshua going in to go take over Jericho, and before I'm not going to go through the whole story and stuff like that because it'll take some time. But basically, you find that Joshua's about to go and conquer the land and stuff like that, and he takes 2 spies and send them to Jericho. And they go over. They slip into the city. They're going around, and all of a sudden, some guards are trying to chase them. Whatever. They try to hide, and Rahab hides them on the roof and whatever, and they're hiding and whatnot. And then Rahab helps them escape. Now, you go to Joshua 2, you can find all this. There's something very interesting that you find when you go to Hebrews 11 verse 31. You actually find that Rahab actually comes up there. If you want to read that.
By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies.
Then if you go to James 2:25, you find she comes up again.
And in the same way, was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way?
Becomes kind of interesting. How one thing that becomes kind of interesting is when you look at the context of these 2 verses. The first one is in Hebrews 11, which is usually like the Hall of Faith, where it talks about like how all these guys are justified by their faith, and you can just go through Abraham and all these different people, and the writer's really just hitting home, talking about how each of them are justified and stuff like that. And the question is, why was Rahab saved? Why is she justified by her faith? And it's interesting how James uses this sort of argument that if you look in the chapter, he's basically talking about how like works and faith and different things like that, and he uses her as an example as well, which becomes kind of interesting because a lot of people argue, well, are you saved by faith or are you saved by works? And they usually look at like Paul and like James and kind of like debate between the two. But it's interesting how she's using an example for both, which is kind of a small subtlety, but it's kind of interesting how like it's just interesting subtlety. But yeah, why is she saved? No guesses? Oh, wrong answers first, if anything. Hold on, no? Okay. Well, it turns out she believed in the God of Israel regardless of her people. She knew that the land belonged to them and not her own people. She was willing to commit treason to save God's people over her own. There's another thing too, is she made a deal with them knowing that God would deliver them the victory anyway. She didn't have to think about this. She didn't debate. She knew that they were coming, and this is actually a sort of a little interesting note too. Like, if you look at if you look at some of the different Bible stories and stuff like that, what you find is that the story of the Exodus and different things like that like actually passed through. And by the time when you read this chapter, Joshua chapter 2. By the time you get to this point, Rahab actually already knows the story about what happened in Egypt. And all the city's scared and they're terrified of the Israelites that are coming. And it becomes kind of interesting because like her people know the story. And she believes this story way more, to the point where she's literally willing to abandon everything because she knows what God's actually going to do. She lives in this pagan culture. All these different people, they have all these, like all these different other gods and goddesses, but she's like, no. And there's another thing too, I think in this chapter, this is the first time this is the first time it actually uses this phrase that we kind of use a lot, and it's the God of heaven and heaven and earth. Or I think she says like of heaven and below earth and all this sort of things, but like that's the first time that phrase is actually used in the Bible. And she's the one that actually first uses it. The fact that she, as a pagan person who's not part of the Jewish community, she recognizes the God that created everything, the God that's supreme over everything. She lived by faith, and she didn't just talk about her faith. It's one thing if you believe in something to be true. Yeah, you can believe something to be true. But it's another thing if you actually believe it to be true and you actually have it walk out in your own life. See, those are 2 very different things. And that's kind of like the whole issue when you get to James. Like most people try to talk about like, well, if you're saved, you got to do all these sort of things. And he talks about sort of the issue of works that like if someone has faith, let me show you their faith by their works. He's not saying that this person is saved because they did like all these whole bunch of things. What he's actually talking about is if you're actually saved, you actually believe it. Like I remember, I don't know if I told this story already or not, but I remember one time We were at a summer camp, and there's some kids right next to me. They're it's in the middle of the week where they did the altar call, right? And they're saying, if you want to give your heart to Jesus, come up forward, all this and that. We're all like 14 at the time, and all this and that. And I had two kids next to me, and one was like, "Bro, you want to go up? I mean, if you're ready, I'll go too." All right, so they go up. They go and they give their hearts to Jesus. You know what it turns out? This kid's a Christian. He's done this like 2 years in a row, and they give scholarships every year.
Guess what?
They do this every year, and they get scholarships every year so they can come back later in the summer. So, I mean, some people, all because you can say you believe in Jesus, but if you don't actually commit your life to it, that's a whole nother thing. So, yeah, one thing, the reason why she's justified in her salvation is because her she demonstrated the faith that she have through her works. It's not that her work saved her, but that she believed this above everything else. And when the spies come in the city, it's not like she has to debate, should I do this? She knows, she sees them, she hides them, and she has a plan. And she talks to them and says, when you guys come and destroy the city, spare my house and my family. And they make that agreement. Now here's where we get to the issue of prophecy. A promise was made to her that anyone in her house would be safe. She asks for any, she says, "Oh, spare my brother, my sister, all these people." But that's not what the agreement actually was. The agreement was actually anyone in your household will be safe. And you can find that in Joshua 2:18-19. And it's kind of interesting because when you look at that, it actually doesn't matter who's in the house technically, the way the agreement was made. As long as you were in that house, you were safe. It turns out this is actually kind of interesting because you can make the same analogy with Passover. Because the same thing happened was if you were inside, the whole point was you were supposed to be inside by a certain time, and you're supposed to take the blood of the lamb and put it on the doorpost. And as long as your household had the blood you didn't have to worry about the angel of death and all these sort of things. But the interesting thing is it doesn't actually matter who was in the house or not. If you were outside, well then you had some problems. If you were inside the house, then presumably you were safe. See, the Egyptian could have came over to the Israelite house, and for dinner, not knowing what was going on, he would have been fine. It's kind of interesting how you can kind of look at some of these. But anyway, then you get to first. Another thing is part of the agreement was she had a scarlet cord that she put out the window. That scarlet cord is very, very specific because we get to 1 Chronicles 16 verse 18.
To you I will give the land of Canaan as your portion for an inheritance.
This becomes kind of interesting. You can find literally the same thing in Psalms 105 verse 11. But the word portion here is very misleading because the word itself can literally mean a cord, a rope, a territory, company, or different things like that. And the whole idea was that it was a specific type of length of measurement that they used, so that became the measurement you used when you're doing everything. So the whole point of the cord was it was kind of used as in if you're marking out a mile or whatever, this is the legal measurement you use. That's it has some interesting sort of symbolic sort of references that are attached to it. So when you look at the cord, a lot of times the cord can be attached to the idea of land inheritance, which is why they say here the portion, but the actual word itself is literally a cord or a rope. But it's just that sort of analogy that's kind of drawn between the two. The reason why this is important is because this is sort of an inheritance. This sort of concept is coming back to the whole promise in Abraham that Abraham's seed was going to have the land and that they were the one that were supposed to inherit it and different things like that. Of course, this cord is symbolic for a covenant. And this covenant is the thing that keeps her safe. That she has this cord and she hangs it out the window and that's what keeps her safe. This covenant, again, is the same thing. It's symbolic for Abraham's covenant, and she's actually, identifying with God of Israel with the scarlet cord that she hangs out her window. And it's just like the sort of idea of Passover, how all of a sudden the whole idea was you have the blood of the lamb. That was supposed to be the promise that you take the blood of the lamb, you put it over your thing, and you're safe. It's the exact same sort of idea. The only difference is it's not like the doorpost; it was the window. We find later she actually marries into the tribe of Israel in Matthew 1:5, and we'll talk about that point in a little bit because it gets a little interesting. But what becomes kind of what happens is I think in King James it instead of translating if you ever go back and look at Joshua chapter 2, when it says a silver I don't know why I keep saying silver cord. When it says the scarlet cord the first time, it uses the word thread when it's actually like a rope. Technically, I don't know, like they do that. But when you look later in the chapter, it actually uses this other word for cord, which is kind of interesting how it has like two different Hebrew words that it uses for this. But that's neither here nor there. But it's interesting how the idea of the scarlet thread or the cord is essentially this sort of promise of the Messiah. And all throughout history, Satan is constantly trying to destroy the scarlet cord. Now we're going to go into a really rated R story, and I apologize for you guys, but it's part of the Bible. We're going to talk about he doesn't want to read it. It's part of the Bible. We're going to talk about the story of Tamar, okay? I'm going to warn you, it's crazy. I skipped a lot of details. We're going to go to Genesis 28, 11 to 13, then we'll jump down to 15, and then we'll jump to 17 to 18. You can go back and read the full rated R story if you want later, if you want, but.
Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father.
Oh, before, so there is a whole bunch of weird stuff that okay, so let me explain the daughter-in-law thing. So before we get there, basically there was she married I forgot one of his sons or something like that, which is why this whole thing happened. And I forgot what happened, like a child died or he died or something like that. And then this happens. Okay. Just to put this into perspective.
So he's going to say the son dies.
I believe it was the son dies, yes. And then some issues happened where some weird things with the law happened where there was supposed to be like a kid and different things. It's a really weird story, but I left out a lot of details for just for sake of cleanness. Go ahead. Sorry.
Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house till Selah, my son grows up. For he has feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in his father's house, at her father's house. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers. He and his friend Hira the Adullamite. And when Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, when Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He answered, I will send you a young goat from the flock, and said, if you give me a pledge until you send it. He said, what pledge shall I give you? She replied, your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand. So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him.
And then you continue on the chapter going to Genesis 38, 24 to 29.
About 3 months later, Judah was told, Tamar, your daughter-in-law has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality. And Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. And she was brought out, as she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, by the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant. And she said, please identify whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff. Then Judah identified them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Selah, and he did not know her again. When the time of her labor came, there were twins in her womb. And when she was in labor, one put out his hand, and the midwife took and tied the scarlet thread on his hand, saying, this one came out first. But as he drew back in his head, behold, his brother came out, and she said, what a breach you have made for yourself. Therefore his name was called Perez.
Okay. So, interestingly enough, you go to Ruth 4:18 to 22, and this is essentially the verse. I just broke it up so you can see that there's essentially 10 generations, going from Perez all the way down to David. Or I guess 11, depending on how you want to count. The reason why I bring that up is because you get to Deuteronomy 23, verse 11. It turns out any illegitimate child was considered ceremonially unclean until that whole lineage was from that illegitimate child was considered unclean until the 10th generation. After the 10th generation, that lineage was considered clean. Turns out Judah wronged Tamar, and she had a child. 10 generations later, her lineage is connected to the Messiah. It's very interesting, it's connected to David, it goes to David, and that's connected to the Messiah. It's very interesting how, like, even though something happened, it was a bad situation, God still used her lineage anyway. He waited, like, the full time the law passed, where it was 10 generations, and then he actually kind of renewed, not renewed, I don't know how to, what's the right word? He kind of honored her in that sort of way, if that makes sense, which becomes kind of interesting. How even though, even though this story happened, David wouldn't have been born without that story. Which is just a little food for thought. Turns out there's another interesting thing. Remember Rahab? She married Salman. You can find that in Matthew 1:5 where she married him. There's a couple other references you can find where she married him and stuff like that. Turns out he is actually a direct descendant from Tamar. Rahab becomes part of the lineage of the Messiah. And this was only done because of her faithfulness to God. I talked about a lot so far. I need just make sure you guys aren't overwhelmed yet, because I'm about to go through Esther. All right, let's chug through this. Going through Esther, here's sort of the book of Esther is very, very interesting. Like, I remember seeing some things, and there's been not a lot, but there's like some big like church figures throughout history that argue the book of Esther shouldn't have been canon because it doesn't directly talk about God, and like you can't find the name directly in it and different things like that. And it's very interesting because this is one of my favorite books for to talk about prophecy, because if you don't understand the book of Esther, you can't actually understand prophecy, like true prophecy. And there's so many reasons why. I'm going to show you sort of the highlight of it, because we can, and this is let's go through this. Before you get to Esther, you have to understand something. Back in the Old Testament, 1 Samuel 15, 2-3, there's an issue that kind of arises, if you want to read that.
Thus says the Lord of hosts, I have noted what Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on the way when they came out of Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey.
Wow, that's so terrible. It turns out there's a whole bunch of different reasons why, and we touched a little bit on Bible study a while ago, but there's a whole study there. We're not going to get into this. Then you get to 1 Samuel. You go a little further down the chapter to verse 7 to 8.
And Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and devoted to destruction all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fattened calves and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless, they devoted to destruction.
So here, God instructed them, destroy everything, and he didn't do that. Now we get back to Esther, putting you to some overtime, Esther, essentially chapter 3, kind of bouncing around like verse 1, 8, and 10, just to get the gist of the story.
After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the province of your kingdom. Their law is different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews.
So basically, if you go through the rest of the book of Esther, he basically has this whole edict signed that basically that they're allowed to kill the Jews and take all their stuff and stuff like that on a certain date. And this is like further down the line. The king doesn't realize this. What's interesting is why is Haman doing this? Any guess? Well, it turns out he was an Agagite. Right, and there's a little debate exactly how this worked out, because on the one hand, Saul spared the king, right? But on the other hand, how in the world did just the king manage to slip away? Because afterwards, I think it was Nathan came by and just Saul, what are you doing? Just slaughter the king, and then kept going forward, But what's kind of interesting is some people look at the region, they think that maybe he actually didn't do what fully even that is actually go to each of the villages and destroy everything and kind of go through. So exactly how some of the lineage actually persist is some people debate about exactly how those details work out. But either way, because Saul didn't actually do what God commanded, here all of a sudden we have Haman, who's actually sitting here trying to destroy all the Jews. Here's an interesting thing. If Saul would have listened to God, the book of Esther would have never happened. I mean, Esther probably would have been a woman. She probably would have been born, and the king probably would have been looking for a wife, and she probably would have been married. But this event probably might not have happened. And if it was, it wouldn't have been with Haman, or something else would have happened, Again, this is one of Satan's plans to basically just wipe out the Jewish nation and to prevent the Messiah from coming, right? Because at this point, this is actually kind of an interesting point. They're under captivity. At one point, King Cyrus comes along and frees them, sends them back to their promised land, and different things are going on. But this is kind of where you're getting towards the end of the New Testament, where a lot of things are happening, but there's not as many prophets anymore. And then there's a 400 years, and this is kind of before that period. But this is kind of the end where things are starting to wind down, and then things are just kind of relaxing a little bit. And we get this interesting story of Esther here, and you're, in the middle of all this, right? And then, have all these 400 silent years, but it's interesting how, before all that happens, before the a few hundred years before the Messiah comes in, Satan's over here trying to completely exterminate God's people from the face of the earth. Then you get to Esther 4, 13 to 14, and this is my favorite part of the entire book, so you guys are aware.
Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if he keeps silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this."
It's interesting how Esther took part in stopping the destruction of the line of David, or the line of the Messiah. She saved that scarlet cord that goes all the way back to Rahab and Tamar. What's kind of interesting too, this is kind of where we talk about that sort of issue of free will. This is one of my favorite verses for a couple of different reasons. Because on the one hand, it shows a lot that's going to happen, right? The Jews are about to get destroyed. Okay. But at the same time, it's interesting what Mordecai says here. He says, don't think you'll escape this, because if she sits back, there's a chance you'll still die anyway. That's basically what he's saying. But then he also says that the deliverance of the Jews will arise from another place. Doesn't matter what Esther chooses right now. He's letting her know that it doesn't matter what you do. God's gonna save the Jews somehow. But then, he brings in this whole idea that, maybe we were born for such a time as this. This whole fact that God, God's will goes through. She doesn't directly have to intervene. God's going to do something regardless. But she has this great opportunity here to completely change the course of history. This is why it's one of my favorite verses, because you can get to a whole bunch of interesting sort of discussion about free will versus predestination here, because, like we were talking about earlier, this whole issue, the fact of this whole verse, it doesn't matter what's going to happen. God's will is going to be accomplished. It's how God's will gets accomplished, which is the interesting thing. And I believe that is all we'll talk about today. Next time, we'll kind of go through, depending on how time runs, I plan on going through all the situations where Jesus meets some sort of woman in the Bible, in the New Testament. That is very ambitious. So we'll see how that lines up. But it should be fun anyway.